everyone is looking for an alternative to the US. The problem is the US is about 17% of the world's global trade. So not that easy to simply replace the US. And even if you do, you are probably going to replace it with another country that's not going to pay as much. But importantly, it's the 350 million wealthiest people in the world. So that's...
This is the Natal Strait bulk container terminal south of Johannesburg. Up to 30,000 tons of cargo is moved out of this terminal every month. Most of it is destined for Asia.
China is South Africa's largest trade partner. The bulk of South African exports to the Asian giant comprises minerals and agricultural products. Logistics group Land and Sea Shipping believes the U.S. tariffs will negatively impact several local industries, but says it is seeing increased trade to the east.
The United States thought higher tariffs would force South Africa to fall in line. Instead, something unexpected happened. Within months, South Africa quietly changed its trade strategy, and Washington was caught off guard. American exporters started losing ground, new partners stepped in, and the balance of trade began to shift. This wasn't just a trade adjustment, it was a strategic move that exposed a major US miscalculation. So how did South Africa turn US tariffs into an advantage, and why is Washington now worried?
The tariff hikes were designed to send a clear message. By raising trade barriers, Washington intended to apply pressure, reshape behavior, and remind partners of economic power. The expectation was familiar. Targeted economies would feel the strain, recalibrate their policies, and ultimately return to the negotiating table on terms favorable to the United States. Yet in the case of South Africa, the outcome unfolded very differently. Instead of compliance, the tariffs triggered a strategic pivot that not only softened the blow but reversed the leverage. In Washington, the realization came quietly but sharply. The pressure campaign had backfired. The move surprised policy circles because the stakes were significant. Tariffs were meant to protect domestic industries and signal toughness at a time of heightened global competition. South Africa, an important trade partner and a gateway economy to the African continent, was expected to absorb the shock and seek accommodation. Instead, Pretoria responded with a calculated adjustment that altered trade routes, deepened alternative partnerships, and reduced dependence on the United States market. What followed exposed a deeper miscalculation: the assumption that access to the United States economy was still an irreplaceable lever in a rapidly changing global system. The background to the tariff decision was rooted in a broader shift toward protectionism. Faced with domestic political pressure, supply chain vulnerabilities, and rising competition from emerging economies, Washington leaned on tariffs as a blunt instrument. The goal was twofold. Economically, the policy aimed to shield key industries and correct trade imbalances. Politically, it projected resolve, signaling that the United States would no longer tolerate arrangements perceived as unfavorable. South Africa found itself caught in this recalibration, despite its long-standing commercial ties and strategic relevance. Washington's expectations were shaped by precedent. Historically, when access to the United States market became more expensive, exporting nations sought exemptions, concessions, or compromises. South Africa's export sectors, from manufactured goods to agricultural products, were seen as vulnerable to higher barriers. The belief was that economic pressure would translate into policy alignment. In addition, the tariffs carried symbolic weight, reinforcing the idea that global trade still revolved around Washington's decisions. The calculation underestimated the degree to which global trade had already diversified. For South Africa, the tariffs arrived at a moment of reassessment. The domestic economy faced familiar challenges, including energy constraints, employment pressures, and the need for industrial modernization. Yet the response to the tariffs was not reactive. It was strategic. Instead of focusing solely on preserving access to the United States market, policymakers accelerated efforts already underway to broaden trade relationships. The emphasis shifted toward resilience rather than reliance. Trade diversification became the central pillar of the response. South Africa intensified engagement with Asian economies, where demand for commodities, agricultural products, and manufactured goods continued to grow. Existing relationships were expanded, and new channels were opened. Participation in broader Global South frameworks gained urgency, not as a gesture of defiance, but as a practical hedge. By spreading export destinations, South Africa reduced exposure to any single market's policy shifts. At the same time, South Africa leaned into multilateral partnerships that prioritized South-South trade. These arrangements offered lower barriers, growing consumer bases, and fewer political conditions. The logic was straightforward. If one door narrowed, several others could be widened. Over time, this redirection began to show results. Export volumes stabilized, and in some sectors, alternative markets compensated for reduced access to the United States. Domestic economic strengthening complemented the external shift. Rather than treating tariffs solely as a loss, South Africa used the moment to reassess industrial policy. Incentives encouraged value-added production, aiming to export finished or semi-finished goods rather than raw materials alone. This approach not only improved margins, but also reduced vulnerability to commodity price swings. The tariffs, intended as a constraint, inadvertently became a catalyst for internal reform. Infrastructure and logistics adjustments followed. Ports, transport corridors, and customs processes were optimized to serve new trade routes. Businesses adapted supply chains to meet different standards and consumer preferences. While these changes required investment and coordination, they also built long-term capacity. The result was a more flexible export system capable of responding to shifting global demand. As South Africa adjusted, the United States began to feel the consequences. American exporters and firms with established links to South African markets encountered reduced access and stiffer competition. In sectors where collaboration had been mutually beneficial, uncertainty replaced predictability. Opportunities for joint ventures and market expansion narrowed as South Africa prioritized partners less exposed to sudden policy shifts. The loss of leverage became evident in trade data and diplomatic tone. Tariffs had been expected to reinforce Washington's negotiating position, but instead they weakened influence. Once alternative markets proved viable, the urgency to accommodate United States demands diminished. The balance shifted from dependency to choice. For Washington, this represented a strategic setback, not because trade ceased, but because it became optional. The miscalculation lay in underestimating structural changes in global trade. The assumption that the United States market remained uniquely indispensable no longer held. Emerging economies had expanded their purchasing power, and logistics networks had matured. Digital trade, regional agreements, and diversified finance reduced the dominance of any single hub. In this environment, tariffs risked accelerating the very diversification they sought to prevent. The political dimension added another layer. Trade policy was closely watched across the African continent, where many governments had long debated how to balance relations with traditional partners against new opportunities. South Africa's response offered a visible case study. Rather than being isolated or weakened, the country demonstrated adaptability. This sent a signal that policy autonomy was possible, even under pressure. Other African nations took note. For economies evaluating industrial strategies and trade alignments, the lesson was clear. Over-reliance on a single market carried risks. Diversification was no longer a long-term aspiration, but an immediate necessity. Regional integration efforts gained renewed attention, as did partnerships with Asia and the Middle East. The ripple effects extended beyond South Africa, reshaping conversations about economic sovereignty. For United States-Africa relations, the episode marked a turning point. Tariffs, once seen as a tool to enforce discipline, appeared increasingly counterproductive. While Washington remained an important partner, its approach raised questions about reliability and predictability. In a competitive global landscape, partners valued stability as much as access. Policies perceived as punitive risk driving alignment elsewhere. The global implications were significant. Trade power was no longer defined solely by market size, but by connectivity and cooperation. Countries capable of offering consistent terms, infrastructure investment, and long-term planning gained appeal. As South Africa deepened ties with alternative partners, the global trade balance subtly adjusted. Influence flowed toward networks rather than centers. Economic analysts emphasized that the significance of South Africa's move lay not in immediate trade volumes, but in trajectory. The shift signaled a long-term reorientation that could outlast any single tariff regime. Once supply chains and partnerships adapt, reversing course becomes difficult. Tariffs, by their nature temporary, can trigger permanent change. The United States president's broader trade agenda faced scrutiny as a result. While tariffs promised quick results domestically, their international effects proved complex. Protecting industries at home did not automatically translate into influence abroad. In some cases, it reduced it. South Africa's response highlighted the limits of unilateral pressure in an interconnected economy. The strategic lesson extended beyond trade. Economic statecraft relied on credibility. When partners perceived policies as unpredictable, they adjusted accordingly. South Africa's recalibration was rational rather than confrontational. It reflected a calculation that resilience required options. The success of that approach challenged assumptions about who held the upper hand. Long-term implications continued to unfold. As South Africa strengthened ties within emerging markets, opportunities for technology transfer, investment, and industrial collaboration expanded. These relationships were not without challenges, but they diversified risk. The United States, meanwhile, faced the prospect of diminished presence in sectors it once dominated. Regaining ground would require more than tariff adjustments. Experts analyzing the episode pointed to timing as critical. The tariffs arrived during a period of global realignment, when supply chains were already under review. Instead of slowing diversification, the policy accelerated it. South Africa's readiness to pivot suggested that preparation mattered. Countries that anticipated volatility fared better than those that reacted late. The narrative also underscored the importance of domestic capacity. Trade diversification alone was insufficient without internal reforms. South Africa's emphasis on value addition and infrastructure proved essential. By pairing external strategy with internal development, the country maximized the benefits of change. This integrated approach distinguished adaptation from mere survival. For Washington, the challenge was recalibration. The assumption that pressure would yield compliance required reconsideration. Engagement based on mutual benefit, predictability, and partnership appeared more effective than coercion. The South Africa case illustrated that influence depended on alignment of interests rather than enforcement alone. As the dust settled, the tariffs stood as a reminder of unintended consequences. What was intended as leverage became an accelerant for independence. South Africa emerged not unscathed, but strengthened in resolve and capacity. The United States, meanwhile, confronted the reality that power in global trade had become more diffuse. The broader warning was unmistakable. In a multipolar economy, policies designed for an earlier era risked strategic failure. Countries capable of adaptation could turn pressure into opportunity. South Africa did precisely that, reshaping its trade landscape and redefining its options. The final assessment was stark. Tariffs failed to achieve their central objective. They neither secured concessions nor reinforced dominance. Instead, they highlighted the limits of economic coercion. South Africa's strategic response transformed a challenge into a platform for diversification and growth. As global trade continues to evolve, the question lingers. Will future policy choices recognize the lessons of this episode, or will pressure tactics persist despite diminishing returns? The answer may determine not only trade outcomes, but the balance of influence in an increasingly interconnected world.